Thank you so much for that incredibly generous introduction and for inviting me to participate. Thank you more broadly for organizing IDS as a space for urgent conversations. I'm very grateful to have an opportunity to contribute to those conversations. I want to open with an acknowledgement that I am delivering this talk from Glendale, California, the ancestral unceded territories of the Tongva peoples. Omar mentioned, I myself was born in Yerevan and immigrated here in 1991. Much of the work that I do addresses the dispersion of diasporic narratives and cultural memory and the technologies that transmit those narratives. So with that, I will launch into my talk here today. So in this talk, I want to argue for diasporic cultural practices as technologies of world making. I will focus specifically on Armenian diasporas and Armenian diasporic practices of thinking beyond technologies that encode the present, algorithmic and otherwise, to imagine alternative predictive models that forecast liberatory outcomes. To give a sense of the contours of the talk, I'm going to open with two predictive scenarios that plan for a future from which Armenian cultural practices and participation are either omitted or erased. Next, I'll offer some historical and geopolitical context for the artists and projects I'll be discussing, projects that offer alternative models of futurity. And finally, I'll attend to those artists and projects, including a few of my own, and to forms of world making that draw from ancestral memory and from historical practices of prediction to sketch feminist and decolonial futures. Now, onto two predictive scenarios, one fictive and the other very real. The first is an anecdote that originated in the Soviet Union. To understand the anecdote, you only need to know that in the Armenian language, the phrase inchkachka is an idiomatic expression for what's new. It translates literally to what is there and what isn't there. Now the anecdote. After years of research under the cloak of secrecy, a team of computer scientists unveils a supercomputer hailed as the first of its kind. It was designed as an omniscient repository of all the world's knowledge. And here, as an aside, I'll mention that this fictional device might invoke technologies like the BESM-6, a Soviet supercomputer first developed in the 1960s at the Lebedev Institute of Precision Mechanics and Computer Engineering. The computer in the anecdote can process any request instantaneously, retrieve an answer, and print a response to any query with an accuracy rate of 100%. August experts and renowned technologists inspect the machine. They all agree it represents the most complete extant measure of human knowledge. A saying develops that if something doesn't exist in the supercomputer's datasets, then, strictly speaking, it cannot be said to exist at all. News of the curiosity spreads. People travel from distant locales to see the supercomputer and to ask it seemingly unanswerable questions. One day, an Armenian speaker visits. They examine the log of questions the machine has answered to date, and they are decidedly unimpressed. After considering possible queries, possible questions they can ask the computer, the Armenian speaker decides to ask, "How are you?" Again in Armenian, inchkachka, what is there and what isn't there. But the supercomputer misinterprets this as a request to transmit every data point it's been storing, everything it knows. It starts churning data and works around the clock for hours, then days, then weeks. After printing out endless reams of paper, the computer finally declares the task complete. It has retrieved what amounts to the entirety of the world's knowledge. So the Armenian speaker reviews the materials and they are once more dissatisfied. They decide to pose another question, another idiomatic Armenian expression, elinchkachka. What else is there and what else isn't there, or what else is new? When it receives this query, the computer, already overtaxed from its weeks-long exertions, glitches and immediately bursts into flames. This is a diagram illustrating the anecdote developed by Fernando Diaz for my upcoming book mentioned by Omar, Algorithmic Bias Training. So What does this anecdote tell us? First, that there were no Armenian-speaking computer scientists on the research team in this fictive scenario. Second, that systems don't operate as they should when omissions and lopsided knowledge systems are encoded in their datasets. Third, that omissions are vulnerabilities that can be exploited to produce system failures, or what media theorist Wendy Chan has called vulnerable systems with which we can live. Finally, the anecdote reveals that the act of building a given technology is also making a prediction about the world in which that technology will operate. In this case, either through deliberate omission or neglect, the fictional research scientists involved in building this fictional supercomputer predicted that the world the computer would operate in would be one where no colloquial Armenian would be spoken, or where no colloquial Armenian would be necessary. Like the skeptical Armenian speaker in this anecdote, to short circuit certain predictions and the worlds they forecast, we need to ask, what else is there and what else isn't there? In many ways, this anecdote is itself predictive, by which I mean it forecasts the future, which is now our present, where Armenian speech is omitted from the datasets of dominant socio-technical systems. The anecdote prefigures what I'm calling algolinguicism, a matrix of automated processes that minoritize language users outside the global north and obstruct their access to political participation on digital platforms and other sites of digital encounter. It goes without saying that this is only one among many predictive models and socio-technical systems that are working to asymmetrically encode global futures. It's the one that I'm focusing on today. Algolinguicism, I should also note, builds on the idea of linguicism, which is a term coined by Tove Skutnab-Kangas to refer to ideological structures that advantage dominant language users by inequitably distributing power and resources between discrete linguistic communities. Attending to algolinguicism means asking which languages are accorded weight in the development of a platform's algorithms, which speakers are afforded the right to participate on a given platform, and how do linguistic hierarchies materially impact their lived experience? Or simply, whose languages are digital platforms taught to speak? To draw out the stakes of these questions, we can look at digital platforms' failures to intervene in Azerbaijan's recent state-executed digital offensives. In 2018, a report from the Institute for the Future analyzed the rise of state-sponsored campaigns of digital repression and disinformation across the globe, calling these practices a new form of human rights abuse. The report identifies Azerbaijan, a post-Soviet republic in West Asia, as a key offender. Azerbaijan's expansive cyber militias and coordinated attacks can be traced directly to its state apparatus. In one example, a state-funded initiative sought to train youth to, quote, take an active part in the information war, with tactics that game algorithmic outcomes toward, quote, quantitative success for the state. In 2020, disclosures from former Facebook data scientist Sophie Zhang attested to the flourishing of initiatives like these. Zhang revealed that a network of coordinated inauthentic behavior linked again to Azerbaijan's ruling party comprised 1,000 accounts and roughly 8,000 pages. They were dedicated to producing pro-governmental content and engagement, orchestrating attacks against opposition, and amplifying the algorithmic reach of disinformation. Notably, Facebook waited 14 months to investigate. And in the intervening period, Azerbaijan launched an ethnic cleansing campaign targeting the Armenian populated Republic of Artsakh. More on that in a moment. The rationale for inaction was that harm mitigation should focus on top countries and priority regions like the United States and Western Europe. The rationale aims to legitimate socio-technical systems that neglect protections for users of minoritized languages because those users do not, after all, communicate in the lingua franca of top countries. In fact, the platform's moderation algorithms only work in certain languages. And of course, there was also the total absence of Azerbaijani speakers from the platform's global workforce at the time. which would make it impossible to intervene in abuses, given that those abuses could not even be translated or understood. As of August 2020, the platform did not have any full-time or contract operations employees who were known to speak Azerbaijani, leaving staff to use Google Translate to try to understand the nature of the abuse. And finally, in April 2021, still another investigation led by Julia Carey Wong revealed that state-sponsored disinformation networks continued to propagate on the platform. And responding to this unrelenting deluge of revelations about the Azerbaijani state's unchecked platform abuses, Arju Gebeleyeva rightly observed, Facebook is interested in countries like ours. Whether or not digital platforms espouse interests in, quote, countries like ours, which is to say small, non-Western countries, they operate as de facto political actors there. Despite its status as a de facto political actor and a venue for state-sponsored communication, the platform was ill-equipped to understand the primary language used by the overwhelming majority of the nation's speakers. So for example, in one instance of state-sponsored repression, the editors of an oppositional media outlet, Microscope, who were eventually forced to flee Azerbaijan, describe having to moderate 700 hostile comments for a single post. And other dissident commentators have had to appeal to global NGOs when state-sponsored digital abuses and deplatforming attempts occur. Modes of redress within the platform itself are complicated by the fact that the platform has not translated all of its tools and instructions into Azerbaijani. This amounts to a failure to account for a non-dominant language or the abuses that might impact its users. And it represents an exemplary instance of what I'm calling algolinguicism. And here I want to note too that algolinguicism enacts what Mimi Anwoha has called algorithmic violence, a structural harm that, quote, an automated decision-making system inflicts by preventing people from meeting their basic needs, end quote. And here I'm considering political participation and the right to political participation in the absence of abuse as a basic need. Consider users whose preferred language is Azerbaijani or Armenian, accessing these spaces at the moment of the crisis in Artsakh, which I'll refer to in greater length in a minute. Users who lack the resources needed to routinely moderate 700 communiques from bots and bad actors, who have no connections to non or intergovernmental agencies, or who have limited access to robust translation services. For those users, a digital platform's linguicism can be prohibitive to participation. And we should also note that language justice takes on acute importance when we consider that an algorithmically driven, quote, networked public sphere, to borrow from Zeynep Tüfekci, now serves as the infrastructure for much political organizing around the world. Against that backdrop, the effects of algolinguicism are keenly felt within authoritarian regimes where digital platforms become, quote, the place to organize for the opposition, as Arju Gebeleyeva puts it. By most estimates, the preferred language of over 80% of Azerbaijan's population is Azerbaijani, and over half of Azerbaijan's population is monolingual. So what this tells us is that algolinguicist approaches to platform governance effectively hinder or prohibit political participation for millions of monolingual or non-English speaking people across Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Artsakh. And of course, this is representative of broader tendencies across Southwest Asia. In that way, algolinguicism has an epistemic function, by which I mean it encodes certain ways of knowing and languages through which we know, to the exclusion of others. And here I want to turn to the essay Decolonial AI by Shakir Mohammed, Marie-Therese Ping, and William Isaac, who propose that digital spaces created by the internet and the increasingly networked systems and devices we use form digital territories that, like physical spaces, have the propensity to become sites of extraction and exploitation, and thus the sites of digital territorial coloniality. We can see how digital territorial coloniality translates into current cartographies when we look at maps like this one. It was released by the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence as part of their 2021 report. The map documents nations that have already released or are developing AI policies, And as we can see, Southwest Asia and Africa appear as an effective blank here. So the nations developing guidelines are contributing to standard setting, determining which knowledge systems and perspectives will serve as inputs in global discourses on AI. And here I'll return to the questions that I posed earlier. Whose languages are digital platforms taught to speak? To answer the question, and that set of questions is to make a determination about the future, to determine who will be legible in future digital territories, to determine who will be intelligible and who will be consigned to sites of unintelligibility in digital spaces. Like the fictional anecdote I opened with, here, the act of building a socio-technical system is the act of making a prediction about the world in which that system will operate. In the fictional anecdote, research scientists build a supercomputer for a world where no colloquial Armenian will be spoken. In our present, digital platforms encode a future where minoritized language users, here speakers of Azerbaijani and Armenian, are disproportionately subject to algorithmic harms and structurally excluded from sites of political discourse. This is an act of world making, and it's one that coincides with a particular world's end. Before I move into a discussion of cultural practices that are outlining alternative futures and forms of world making, I want to pause here for a second and offer a few additional notes on the historical and geopolitical context that diasporan Armenians are responding to, a context marked by dispossession, displacement, and cultural erasure. So on September 27th in 2020, Azerbaijani forces launched an unprovoked offensive against the Armenian-populated Republic of Artsakh, forcing the outfinanced, outgunned, and outnumbered republic into a defensive struggle for self-governance and survival. Azerbaijan acted with the direct participation of its ally Turkey, and both invoked the neo-Ottoman rhetoric of ethnic cleansing that characterized the 1915 Armenian genocide, which resulted in the deaths of 1.5 million Armenians. Despite that fact, prevailing media narratives characterized the events as a conflict between equally matched belligerents and flattened the reality of Armenian liberation efforts into a tale of, quote, territorial dispute in West Asia. These media narratives displayed what Armenian studies scholar Tamar Shirinyan called an insidiously dispassionate objectivity that elided the truth of the situation. Shirinyan wrote, "The truth is that there are violators, there are agents of violence and dispossession. The most objective form of knowledge is to speak to these truths and to remain responsible to the vulnerable, the marginalized, and the dispossessed." It's important to note that the territory that we're talking about was carved out by Joseph Stalin during the region's Sovietization, renamed Nagorno-Karabakh, and gifted as stolen land to Azerbaijan. Artsakh's population was over 90% Armenian at the time that Stalin absorbed the territory into the Soviets' cartographies in 1921 and dispossessed its people of the right to self-governance. And I'll briefly note here that this image and the next few are drawn from a collaboration with Kamya Abrahamian, which I'll talk about more in a moment. Armenians have been indigenous to what is now the Republic of Artsakh for millennia. The Greek historian Strabo affirms the presence of Armenian-speaking peoples in Artsakh as early as the 2nd century BC. And this is important to note because part of the dialogue around, or rather the autocratic monologue around the events in Artsakh has been an erasure of Armenian indigeneity in the region. After the region was gifted to Azerbaijan in 1921, a policy of Azerbaijani settlement was pursued in an express effort to, quote, dilute the Armenian majority and fortify a settler colonial campaign through indigenous erasure. Today, those settler colonial and genocidal logics suffuse the statements issued by Azerbaijan and Turkey's autocratic rulers. Striking an annihilatory chord, Baku's mayor told a visiting 2005 delegation from Germany, "Our goal is," and this was a public statement, "our goal is the complete elimination of Armenians. You, Nazis, already eliminated the Jews in the 1930s and 40s. You should be able to understand us." and he was subsequently appointed to the post of Deputy Prime Minister after the issuing of this statement. Crucially, I want to note that the claim for Armenian indigeneity in this region is neither commensurate to an ethno-nationalist territorialization, nor is it incompatible with what Nelly Sarkisian has poignantly described as cultivating communal ways of multi-ethnic living and cohabitation. These regions were historically spaces of cohabitation, of multi-ethnic exchange and cross-cultural affiliation across Swana cultures. Sarkisian writes, look what ethno-national state-making has done to our ability to imagine peace in this region, cultivating communal ways of multi-ethnic living. After 6 weeks of struggle, Azerbaijan succeeded in seizing wide swaths of ancestral Armenian lands in 2020, which are now under occupation, displacing 100,000 from Artsakh. The state now occupies Artsakh's cultural capital of Shushi, where President Aliyev will build a school run by the Grey Wolves, a far-right ultra-nationalist pan-Turkic organization that was recently banned in France after its members began to hunt for Armenians on the streets of Lyon. Azerbaijan has also installed a military trophy park featuring a monument fashioned from helmets representing Armenian soldiers killed in battle. And at the same time, the state has implemented a policy of cultural erasure, engaging in the destruction of Armenian monuments in the regions it occupies, and continuing what has been called the worst cultural genocide of the 21st century. The Azerbaijani state justifies this destruction with the claim that the monuments it's destroying are false imposters, not real ancient artifacts, because, counter to an extensive historical record, there could not have been any historical Armenian presence in the region. The state's violence, its rhetoric, and its policy of cultural erasure imagine a settler futurity that's exterminated all remnants of indigenous Armenian life and life worlds. Against that backdrop, it seems impossible to cultivate the political imaginary of a future for Artsakh, especially so for diasporans who are watching this unfold from a distance without a way to intervene. And as I mentioned, the flourishing of Azerbaijan's state-sponsored campaign of digital repression overlaps with and directly supports the campaign of ethnic cleansing that was happening in Artsakh, culminating in the violent seizure of ancestral lands. In Beyond the World's End, T.J. Demos writes that for multitudes, the world's end, measured in the radical rupture of transgenerational cultural traditions, the termination of secure relations to the land, the overturning of stable systems of sovereignty, and the cancellation of self-determination, has occurred repeatedly over the centuries. The effects of this ethnic cleansing campaign were, of course, distributed very differently across Armenian communities in Artsakh, in Armenia, and in the global diaspora, but across these communities, the aftermath of that campaign initiated the end of a particular world and life world as we had known it. So in the latter portion of this talk, I will attend to a disparate set of diasporan artists and cultural workers who have drawn from Armenian pasts to insist that alternative futures are still arriving. And I want to note that I'm not focusing exclusively on artists working with tech or the intersection of art and tech as such, but rather on artists whose work offers alternative models for making predictions about the future, models that challenge algorithmic logics of existing technologies and socio-technical systems. I also want to note that much of my thinking in this section expands on my earlier work for Sylvia Alajaji's Doumanyan Lecture Series earlier this year at the University of Chicago. And I'm very grateful to her for providing an initial context for this conversation. So I want to begin with a project by the Armenian diasporan collective, She Loves. While Azerbaijan's ethnic cleansing and disinformation campaigns were concurrently underway, She Loves designed something like a counteroffensive. The collective initiated an ad hoc digital campaign to label state repression and disinformation. Its premise deliberately invokes a Web 1.0 aesthetic. And when a member encountered a post made by a bot or a disinformation actor, they responded by commenting with a work of ASCII art depicting a rifle. The collective circulated the ASCII rifle to community members, urging them to, quote, replicate this digital rifle and paste it under every online aggression, and encouraging a form of guerrilla content moderation. Nelly Sarkisian and Adrine Bagdasarian, the collective's co-founders, contextualize these tactics through the ethos of dake dakin, roughly translating to strike while the iron is hot. Do it now and do it with no delay. Dake dakin recognizes the compressed timescales associated with action in conditions of crisis against the timescales of state and industry actors who proceed with interminable delay. Appropriating the tools of ASCII imperialism, the collective's members refuse the erasure of minoritized language users, converting platforms into temporary and provisional spaces of transnational feminist struggle. I argue that interventions like these enable us to build toolkits of community-driven tactics for multilingual liberation, to cultivate imaginaries beyond the linguisticism. The project builds on She Love's performance series entitled The Rifles Our Ancestors Didn't Have, which was enacted during the height of the military offensive in Artsakh. Uniformed in white robes imprinted with rifles, the artists of the collective ceremonially marched through the streets of downtown LA in an unauthorized performance, chanting its title, chanting The Rifles Our Ancestors Didn't Have. The work's visual vocabulary drew directly from the gestures and choreographies of nonviolent organizing and evoked earlier works of feminist protest in public space, like Adrian Piper's The Mythic Being and Emma Villanueva's Pasionaria, Walking for Dignity. As Hrag Vartanyan has noted, the visual motif of the armed Armenian woman recalls a widely circulated Ottoman-era photograph of two women fedai, freedom fighters. Pictured with their weaponry, they resolutely embodied the defiance of early Armenian feminist militancy. Bagdasarian and Sarkisian recount that this same photograph, quote, triggered their performance. Of course, official histories of national liberation struggle habitually relegate women to the realm of parenthetical reference. Redressing those omissions, She Loves pointedly centers the crucial labor of women fighters, as well as women cultural producers more broadly. And Sarkisian observes that every time I Google, quote, every time I Google Armenian women artists, I get photos of men. They're all the same men, dressed in the same clothes, in front of those same Armenian primary color paintings. To correct the underrepresentation of Armenian women artists in digital space, She Loves has convened activations akin to the Art and Feminism Wikipedia edit-a-thon, focused on proliferating digital content related to contemporary Armenian women artists. In a similar vein, Rifles attends to the undervalued and undercompensated feminized labor of Armenian craftwork. Outside LA City Hall, the artists assembled on top of woven Armenian carpets and began collectively stitching images of rifles onto individual sewing hoops. They reproduced diasporic memory through an act of weaving what Anne-Marie Fortier has called a diasporic, quote, thread of continuity. In their digital campaign, the historical practice of stitching is translated into a digital procedure, with ASCII characters forming a rifle and invoking the stitches of their sewing hoops at the same time that they invoke Ottoman-era women fedai. What diaspora scholars have called the responsibility to recall in diasporic communities is often coded as a feminized practice. The preservation of cultural memory is cast as invisible and gendered labor, as is the unwaged reproduction of communal social life. Rifles turns these formulations on their head, recasting the labor of recollection as an active force of political transformation. In this way, the performance weaponizes feminist memory work as organized resistance, memory work as the work of future world-making. I included this work in a digital exhibition that I co-curated earlier this year, Sites of Fracture, Diasporic Imaginings of Occupied Artsakh, co-curated with Anahid Oshagan and Ara Oshagan through Reflect Space Gallery. The exhibition was held in conjunction with Armenian Genocide Remembrance Month and with the City of Glendale's IDS series, its series of anti-racism programming. And I will share the exhibition trailer here.
Glendale Library Arts and Culture's Reflect Space Gallery presents Sites of Fracture, Diasporic Imaginings of Occupied Artsakh, a virtual exhibition that brings together diasporan Armenian artists from the United States, Canada, and Germany to build collective counter-narratives to the forces of occupation and cultural erasure in the Republic of Artsakh. Sareri kami, vortegit es galis, yevules shtapun, anhangist u achurnim sareri kami. The global Armenian diaspora was gripped by the collective trauma of watching a campaign of ethnic cleansing unfold via digital screens and social media. As indigenous Armenian heritage faced systemic destruction, diasporan Armenian artists responded with projects that counter the attempted erasure of Armenian identities and histories. The artists and cultural workers of this exhibition are Kami Abrahamian, Ali Kat, Elvina Dichan, Nare Mekirchian, Nelly Sargsyan, She Loves Collective, Scout to Funkjan, Anahit Yajan, and Yerazad Coalition. Sites of Fracture, co-curated by Mashinka Firunts Hakopian, Ara Oshagan, and Anahit Oshagan, gestures towards the repatriation of ancestral lands. The virtual exhibition takes place in the photographically reconstructed fortress of the city of Shushi, Artsakh's historical cultural capital, now occupied by Azerbaijan. Sites of Fracture imagines a decolonized Shushi and an independent Republic of Artsakh.
So as the video notes, the decision to stage the exhibition in a 360-degree virtual reconstruction of occupied Shushi was an attempt to imagine repatriation and renewed cultural presence in ancestral lands. It also meant that works installed in the exhibition space took on the status of monumental artifacts, as seen here in the installation of work by Ali Kat Leeds, a Portland-based artist of Armenian descent who produces work under the name Entangled Roots Press. This work is from Leeds' Tassiography series. Tassiography meaning the method of divination that reads the future in the patterns of coffee grounds, in Armenian bajak nayed. A historically feminized practice, it's been matrilineally transmitted for centuries, enacted in private domestic spaces, intended for kin and intimate coteries. It's among the more informal methods of divination practiced in the diaspora. And in lieu of predictions about marital trajectories and wealth accumulation, the tassiomancer in this series foresees futures marked by decolonization, justice for our communities, and queer liberation. Sociology scholar Karina Karapetyan-Georgi describes tassiography as a form of domestic intelligence or subversive knowledge production. Georgi frames tassiography as Armenian matrilineal rituals and underreported cultural practices that Armenian women use to access distinct forms of intuition-based knowledge that open up an array of possibilities by disorienting time and space. Tassiography in many ways unsettles time. It occupies multiple temporalities. It constitutes a practice that can be traced to the historical past that's enacted in the present to divine a desired future. So in my family, my mother's sister Anahit was the resident doyen of tassiography or bajak nayed. She was believed to be a powerful medium who would boast that she had once contacted the ghost of Alexander Pushkin, whose behavior she characterized as roguish. Recalling the matrilineal practices of tassiography in her own family, Leeds writes that she watched her grandmother quote, read coffee grounds and would notice how oftentimes her grandmother would see what she would want to say. Like most predictive technologies, coffee reading may not divine outcomes programmed in advance so much as it deliberately codes a desired future. That is to say, tassiography represents a form of speculative world making, a method for conjuring the futures the reader may want to see. I'm invoking tassiography and Leeds series as exemplary of diasporic Armenian futurist practices, each looking back toward earlier histories in order to look forward toward speculative futures. As scholars like Sevan Bukyan have argued, diasporic identities in their fragmentation and dispersal are shaped by decentralized forms of meaning-making that emerge in community structures. And in that respect, diasporic identities have the capacity to decenter the nation state as a primary site of meaning and belonging. The fragmentary, non-linear time of diasporas is radically incommensurate, both with the time of the nation state and with the prescriptive futures of algorithmic prediction. Diasporic practices of collective memory work look forward by looking back. They draw their power not from numerical data sets, but rather by insisting on situated, embodied, communal knowledge. Diasporic experience is marked by dislocations and displacements in time and space, by practices of memory work that resist dispossession and erasure. And in that way, diasporic experience and culture making can be said to also inhabit the register of queer time, or what Jose Munoz has famously described as queer futurity, regarding the past as a field of possibility in which subjects can act in the present in the service of a new futurity. Recognizing that the present is not enough, is insufficient, is toxic to queer, diasporic, and racialized bodies, and that the conjuring of alternate futures is a mechanism of survival. I want to point to the fact that I'm framing Armenofuturism in relationship to queer time in dialogue with existing work in the field by some of these scholars listed here: Nelly Sarkisian, Karina Georgi, David Kazanjian, the Armenian Review on Queering Armenian Studies, edited by Georgi and Tamar Shouinian. And of course, this is only a partial list of the interlocutors for this work. And I also want to note very strongly that the techniques, tactics, and tropes of Armenian futurism owe a great debt to the aesthetics of Afrofuturism, Indigenous futurism, Arab futurism, and beyond, each with its own distinctive visual vocabulary, which I have to refrain from discussing here in the interests of time. On screen, though, is a still from the film Space Exodus by Palestinian artist Larissa Sansour, which imagines Palestinian astrofutures. So in her series Tasseography, Leeds uses the Armenian matrilineal practice of coffee ground reading to forecast decolonial borderless futures of queer liberation. As a virtual artifact installed in the space of occupied Shushi, the piece takes on a kind of monumental presence, lending a different sort of weight to its predictions. And I want to end with another work from the Sites of Fracture exhibition and a collaboration that emerged from that work. We're looking at Kami Abrahamian's Recognize Artsakh Now street art campaign, which invited people to download, print, and wheat paste a poster designed by Kami calling for the recognition of Artsakh. Abrahamian is an interdisciplinary writer, artist, producer, performer, organizer, whose work foregrounds ancestral reclamation and diasporic futurism. In their multimedia storytelling project and virtual installation Ensouled, for example, Kami imagines, quote, a near future where state-sanctioned violence has nearly wiped out an entire generation of resistors, elders, and keepers of ancestral knowledge, and follows a solitary botanist and coder, Badaskan, who translates frequencies from the plant life growing in their greenhouse and lab. The frequencies slowly reveal themselves to be secret correspondences between Badas Khan's ancestors, a group of resistors, and practitioners of magic who survived on their own terms in Ottoman Turkey at the turn of the 20th century, end quote. In Recognize Artsakh Now, Abrahamian similarly uses imagery from historical work of queer Armenian cultural output, specifically a work by Sergei Parajanov, The Color of Pomegranates, which was devoted to the life of Armenian Ashur, or troubadour, Sayat Nova, whose biography was marked by persecution and eventual execution. In that way, Recognize Artsakh doubly draws from history, both from the history of Armenian cinema and from the history of 18th century Armenian cultural output depicted in Parajanov's film. The campaign elicited widespread participation, with wheat-pasted versions of the poster popping up at disparate sites across the world. It deployed the networks of distribution and visibility afforded by digital platforms to circulate the digital file designed by Abrahamian, materializing the call for recognition across a wide array of geographical coordinates. At the end of 2020, I collaborated with Abrahamian, Nancy Baker Cahill, and Nelly Sarkisian on an augmented reality monument titled Monument to the Autonomous Republic of Artsakh, a response to the campaign of ethnic cleansing in Artsakh. The impulse behind the monument was to insist and to affirm that Artsakh has a future that will be determined by Artsakhis. Monument to the Autonomous Republic of Artsakh is installed in Glendale, California, the site of one of the largest diasporic Armenian communities in the world. It is geolocated at the intersection of Artsakh Avenue and East Broadway. And I should note that Artsakh Avenue was renamed to Artsakh. It was originally called Maryland after some significant conflict within the community. And it's viewable through the Fourth Wall app. The monument is dedicated to the struggle for self-determination in Artsakh and calls for independence amid the seizure of ancestral lands. As a virtual intervention in physical space, the monument deploys tactics developed by Nancy Baker Cahill in her AR monuments like Liberty Bell and Taking Stock. Nancy's AR monuments are a intern in the field of land art and public art, and they are free to view through the Fourth Wall app, which can be downloaded by anyone with access to a smartphone. Through Fourth Wall app, Nancy's works expand the category of public art in crucial ways, which is something that we wanted to draw on for our monument. Our third collaborator in this project, Nelly Sarkisian, researches feminist diasporic communities of care and is a scholar at Emerson. She contributed the soundscape to the monument entitled Mountain Medley. She describes the soundscape as follows, quote, "These songs on which I draw create a medley that in these times of renewed, reactivated, ongoing, and still unfolding trauma offer response to the crises that the violences of militarization, resource extracting capitalism, and patriarchy create, blocking life-affirming relations. So the medley was about creating opening for those relations in a land-based, like mountain-to-mountain manner." And here I'm going to play a brief clip of the monument installed in Glendale, and I'll note that the audio quality is a little bit dicey. So as an augmented reality work, the monument superimposes virtual futures over the present landscape of Glendale and over Glendale, California's diasporic Armenian community. The phrase Artsakh endures offers a prediction for the future, one that sidesteps the predictive logics of prevailing socio-technical systems and disrupts the erasure of Armenian culture making that those systems encode. One that draws from queer and feminist practices of solidarity to forecast liberatory outcomes that may appear on virtual horizons, outcomes that begin to materialize in asking, what else is there and what else isn't there?